On a Tuesday morning in New York City, the sky was clear, the kind of crisp, blue morning where the sunlight hits the glass of the buildings just right. It was September 11th, 2001. Inside the South Tower of the World Trade Center, 28-year-old Tanya Head was already deep into her day. She was leading a meeting in a sleek, glass-walled conference room on the 96th floor. Her company, Merrill Lynch, had been working on a high-profile merger, and Tanya, known for being composed and razor-sharp, was running point on the deal. Her assistant Christina sat at her right, flipping through documents, while the others quietly waited for Tanya's cue. At 8:46 a.m., a deep, unfamiliar tremor passed through the building. Everyone paused. Then came the sound, low and thunderous, like a huge crash somewhere, off in the distance. The lights flickered. They rushed to the windows. Across the plaza, in the North Tower, thick smoke was pouring from a gaping hole near the top of the building. A silver column stretched high into the sky. Then people began to see them, figures at the windows, some waving fabric, others falling. Tanya remembers someone whispering, "They're jumping." Phones came out. Calls went nowhere. The grid was jammed. Tanya tried to reach Dave, her fiance, who worked in the North Tower, on the 100th floor. No signal. She tried again. Nothing. Just static and the tightening feeling in her stomach. A voice came over the PA system. "Remain where you are. The situation is under control." Some people relaxed. Others didn't. Tanya wasn't convinced. "I'm leaving," she said. She grabbed her purse, looked at Christina, and headed out into the hallway. They made it down to the 78th floor, the Sky Lobby. That's where you catch the express elevators to the ground. But the lobby was chaos. Dozens of people, panicked and pressed against the elevator doors. Someone shouted for calm. Others cried. Then someone screamed, "There's another one coming." There wasn't time to understand. The second plane hit at 9:03 a.m. A roar tore through the building. A white-hot blast of air blew through the sky lobby. Metal groaned. The lights went out. People went flying. Tanya was thrown against a wall. The sound left her ears. For a second, she thought she had died. Everything was orange and black and spinning. She couldn't breathe. Her arm felt wet and wrong, like it had come off, but hadn't. Then, she opened her eyes. The world was unrecognizable. Smoke hung in the air. Fires crackled nearby. The floor was covered in glass, blood, and ash. Christina was gone. So were the elevator doors. Parts of the walls had vanished. And then she saw the body. A man, motionless, his face nearly gone. Next to him, a woman she had seen earlier, now completely mangled under wires and concrete. Tanya froze. She tried to call out, but nothing came. Her mouth was full of dust. Then she felt a sudden impact on her back, sharp, jarring, like someone was striking her. Instinctively, she tried to push them off, but the blows didn't continue. They changed, grew gentler, more deliberate. That's when she realized they weren't hitting her. They were trying to smother the flames. Her clothes were on fire, and whoever it was, they were using a jacket to put them out. When she looked up, she saw a face, partly covered by a red bandana. He had kind eyes. "You need to get up," he said. Tanya couldn't feel her legs. Her arm hung at her side. She told him she couldn't move. "You can," he said. "Come on, you can." He knelt beside her, helped her stand, guided her through the rubble. All around them, fires burned. The walls were cracked open. She saw people crawling, screaming, burned, bloody. A man was calling for his wife. Another had his leg trapped under a beam. Tanya stumbled past a body and stopped. A man, burned beyond recognition, was holding something out. It was a ring. "Please," he said, voice almost gone. "Give this to my wife." She took it, nodded, promised she would. Then he died. The man in the red bandana didn't stop. He kept moving. He led her to a stairwell that was still intact. "This is it," he said. "Go." She told him she couldn't do it alone. He looked her in the eyes and said, "You're gonna make it, but I've got to go back." And with that, he turned and disappeared into the smoke. Tanya didn't know how she made it down. She remembers trying to hold her arm in place with her jacket. People rushed past her. The smell of jet fuel, the feel of blood in her shoes, screams echoing down the stairwell. At some point, a firefighter scooped her up. She doesn't remember his face, just that his arms were strong, and he told her she was okay. He carried her down and out onto the street. But the moment they got outside and she tried to stand, her legs gave out. She collapsed on the pavement, disoriented and barely conscious. The firefighter didn't hesitate. He dragged her beneath a nearby fire truck for shelter. The ground trembled. The roar was deafening. A few seconds later, the south tower began to fall. She doesn't remember the collapse, only the darkness, the dust, the sudden quiet. The next thing she remembers is waking up in a hospital. 6 days had passed. She was in a burn unit, hooked up to machines. Her arm had been reattached. Her body was covered in gauze. Her parents were sitting beside her. Her first words were, "Where's Dave?" No one answered. Eventually, her mother took her hand. He hadn't made it. Dave's tower, the North Tower, had collapsed at 10:28 a.m. There were no survivors from his floor. He was gone. Tanya closed her eyes, and everything went quiet. Dave wasn't just her fiance. He was the reason New York felt like home. They'd met outside the World Trade Center 2 years earlier. It was raining, and they both reached for the same cab. He smiled, handed her his business card, and said, "Only if you promise to call." She rolled her eyes but did. Their first date was coffee. Their second, a 3-hour walk around Central Park. By the third, she knew. Dave had this easy confidence, a gentle way of taking up space without making it feel crowded. He volunteered at a soup kitchen, remembered every waiter's name, and had a bad habit of losing his keys, but never his patience. He wrote her notes, on paper, not texts. She kept them in a shoebox under the bed. They'd just moved into a little apartment uptown. The wedding was weeks away. White dress, rooftop venue, guests. They'd even picked out their song. He wanted kids. She wanted a dog. So they compromised and got a golden retriever named Elvis. Everything about their life together felt real, steady, safe. But nothing else mattered now. The apartment still stood, and Elvis would be waiting at home, probably curled up on the couch like always. But Dave was gone. The wedding, the life they built, the future they planned, it had all been ripped away in a single morning. And just like that, everything went dark. In the days after the towers fell, New York City fell silent. A place known for its rush and roar suddenly moved in slow motion. Ash clung to every surface. Missing posters lined every block. First responders clawed through mountains of steel, hoping for miracles. And across the country, people sat in stunned silence, unable to make sense of what they'd witnessed. Nearly 3,000 people were gone, but even those who survived weren't the same. Many stopped speaking, others couldn't stop reliving it. And then, there was Tanya Head. She didn't show up on the news or write a book. She joined an online forum, quietly. She typed out a short message that hit like a punch to the gut. Going through it once was more than enough, but I think I need to talk to someone. Slowly, over the next few weeks, she started to open up. Her story was tragic and unforgettable. She said she'd been on the 78th floor of the South Tower when the second plane hit, that she saw people jumping, that she'd tried to call her fiance, Dave, but couldn't get through, that she was pulled from the wreckage by a man in a red bandana, and that when she woke up in the hospital, her parents had to tell her, Dave didn't make it. She never spoke dramatically, never made it about herself, but her words felt like something sacred. Survivors listened. For the first time, they felt understood. She described the smell, the heat, the screams, the way time bent and fractured, the guilt of walking out when so many others didn't. And maybe more than anything, she remembered all of it. The community rallied around her. She showed up at survivor meetings, humble and helpful. She remembered names, comforted strangers, made people feel less alone. And without meaning to, without asking for it, Tanya Head became the face of the 9/11 survivors. The woman who had lived through the impact zone, who had loved and lost, who had stood in the rubble and come back to tell the story. But one part of her story, the part that stayed with people the longest, was about the man who saved her, the one in the red bandana. Tanya didn't know who he was, just that he showed up when she needed him most. He told her to stay awake. He led her through the wreckage. When she said she couldn't keep going, he told her she could. And when they finally reached a stairwell, he sent her on without him. She begged him not to leave, but he just looked at her and said, "You're gonna make it, but I've got to go back." Then he turned and disappeared into the smoke. Later, she told his story to anyone who would listen. She didn't know his name, only that he'd risked everything to save her, that he'd gone back into the fire when most people were running from it. At first, he was just a mystery. A nameless figure passed between survivors like a myth. But over time, pieces started to come together. There were others, men and women, who told stories just like hers. A man in a red bandana, carrying people down flight after flight of stairs, using a fire extinguisher to push back flames, guiding the injured to the only stairwell still intact, then disappearing to find more. Eventually, his name surfaced. Wells Crowther, 24 years old, an equities trader, a volunteer firefighter since he was a teenager. His family recognized him from the stories, from the details, from that red bandana. As a child, Wells's father had given him that bandana as a keepsake. He'd carried it every day since. On September 11th, he used it to cover his face and walked into hell. He saved at least 18 people that day, maybe more. His body was found 6 months later, in a command center with members of the FDNY, deep inside the South Tower wreckage. For survivors like Tanya, he wasn't just a hero. He was the reason they were still alive, a symbol of selflessness, proof that even in the worst moment of their lives, someone chose to run back in. Tanya met his parents not long after his name was released. They embraced her like family. At his memorial, she gave a tearful speech, sharing how he'd found her in the smoke, how he'd told her to keep going. She said she carried a photo of him in every room of her home, that he gave her the courage to live, that because of him, she did. The discovery of the man in the red bandana only deepened the meaning of Tanya's story. Survivors, strangers, even reporters began asking about him. Tanya always said the same thing. He saved my life. She spoke of him with reverence, like he was a guardian angel. And to many, he was. But what made Tanya different wasn't just her story. It was what she did with it. While the world mourned the dead, she quietly fought for the living. She showed up to support groups and survivor forums, always ready with a kind word or a late-night message to someone who needed it. People said it felt like she saw them, really saw them. At in-person meetings, she didn't command attention. She earned it. She listened more than she spoke. She got to know everyone, offered rides, and checked in on people when they disappeared. Over time, something shifted. She wasn't just one of them anymore. She became the person people turned to. Tanya began organizing events, speaking at memorials, and reaching out to local officials. Survivors who had felt overlooked suddenly had someone in their corner. She pushed for access to Ground Zero and fought for mental health resources. People began to see her not just as a fellow survivor, but as the one leading them forward. By the 4th anniversary of the attacks, her story wasn't just known, it was respected. Her name appeared in articles, her face in photo ops, and when visitors came to the site, it was her voice they heard on the tours. She had become the symbol of what it meant to survive and keep going. She never sought that role, never pushed for the spotlight. but to those around her, she earned it. The 6th anniversary of September 11th was fast approaching, and the energy around it felt different. For years, the focus had been on honoring the fallen, comforting grieving families, and remembering the chaos of that day. But now, 6 years later, people wanted something more. They were looking for stories of endurance, for the people who had made it out alive, and what they had done with that second chance. Newsrooms across the country were preparing special coverage. They wanted to put a face to survival, a story that could still move people to tears. Someone who had not only lived through the horror, but had carried others through it too. And all roads led to one name: Tanya Head. Her story had spread through survivor circles and advocacy networks. She wasn't always in the media or a regular guest on talk shows, but in the background, she had become something more powerful, a symbol. The woman from the 96th floor, the one who escaped the South Tower after being burned and buried in rubble, the one who had lost her fiance in the other tower, the one who had stood in the footprints of the fallen and helped others find their way forward. She was already giving private tours of Ground Zero, already speaking at closed-door events, already comforting others with a calm, composed presence and a story that felt larger than life. Her scarred arm and quiet voice said what words couldn't. People trusted her, believed her, and felt better after hearing her speak. So when the New York Times began planning their centerpiece anniversary profile, the editors didn't hesitate. They wanted her. The woman whose survival had touched the lives of so many without ever asking for anything in return. All they needed was her yes. Just one interview. But getting that interview proved more complicated than anyone expected. At first, it seemed like a sure thing. When the New York Times reached out, they approached her with reverence. They made it clear, this wasn't an expose or a political piece. It was a tribute, a reflection, a way to honor the survivors who had carried so much. And no one carried more, it seemed, than Tanya. She didn't say no, but she didn't say yes either. She postponed the first meeting, citing exhaustion. Then another. This time, she was out of town. When they offered to send questions by email, she stopped replying. Calls went unanswered. Messages were left unread. It was strange, but not suspicious. Survivors often had complicated relationships with the spotlight. And if anyone had earned the right to be cautious, it was her. Still, the Times didn't want to miss out. They tried again, reaching out through friends, colleagues, and Survivor Network members. Each time, Tanya gave a different reason. Too busy, too tired, not ready. She insisted it wasn't about them. She just didn't want the focus to be on her. But the 6th anniversary was looming, and they had to run something. So the Times made a decision. If she couldn't sit down for a full interview, they'd still tell her story. And they'd fill in the gaps the old-fashioned way, through research, to ensure it was told with the respect and accuracy it deserved. She was everything people wanted to believe in after September 11th. A Harvard and Stanford graduate who had landed a prestigious position as a senior associate at Merrill Lynch on the 96th floor of the South Tower, right in the impact zone. A woman with a future so bright it could have lit the skyline. And then there was Dave. He worked just across the way, on the 100th floor of the North Tower, a consultant at Deloitte and Touche. Smart, driven, the kind of guy who commanded attention. He volunteered at soup kitchens, he wrote poetry, he loved the outdoors, and more than anything, he loved Tanya. Together, they were a dream couple. Two young, successful professionals building a life in New York. They'd unofficially committed to each other in a ceremony on a beach in Hawaii and were planning a wedding for October. 500 guests, white roses, a honeymoon already booked. That kind of love. But it never happened. Dave's tower collapsed at 10:28 a.m. He was never found. Tanya, on the other hand, had lived. Barely, pulled from the wreckage with her arm hanging by a thread. She'd gone on to share her story with quiet grace and devastating honesty, which is why, when reporters David W. Dunlap and Serge F. Kowaleski were assigned to write a profile on her for the 6th anniversary, they approached it with reverence. They started with the basics, just to make sure everything was accurate. First, her education. Tanya had said she'd gone to Harvard for undergrad and then earned a graduate business degree from Stanford. They reached out to both universities to confirm her attendance, and neither school had a record of her, at least not under Tanya Head or any variation they were given. But that didn't necessarily mean anything. Maybe she had enrolled under a different name. Maybe they had the wrong schools. The reporters made a note to double-check that detail. Then there was her job. She'd said she worked for Merrill Lynch on the 96th floor of the South Tower. The reporters called the company to confirm her employment history and floor assignment. But again, there was nothing. Merrill Lynch had no employee by that name, and according to their records, they hadn't had offices in that building at all. Something wasn't right, but the reporters understood how things could be mixed up. Perhaps Tanya had used an alias to protect her privacy. She was known for being private, and the reporters' struggle to get an interview made it clear she was hesitant about the spotlight, so it made sense that she might keep some details to herself. Then again, trauma changed people. It blurred time. It confused memory. It was entirely possible that Tanya's story could have been affected by everything she saw that morning. So they turned their attention to the part of her story that everyone remembered. The most emotional piece of all. Dave. He was real. That much was true. David Angel worked for Deloitte and Touche in the North Tower. His name was on the memorial list. Everything she said about him seemed to check out. So, the reporters reached out to his family. Just a few background questions, to learn more about the man whose memory had shaped the last 6 years of Tanya's life. But when they mentioned her name, Tanya Head, there was only silence. Then came the answer no one expected. They'd never heard of her. Not once. Not before the attacks. Not after. Not ever. The reporters gently clarified that Tanya Head might not be her real name, that perhaps she had gone by something else. They explained that they were having trouble verifying her background under the name she provided, so they were hoping the family could help point them in the right direction. They told them they were putting together a story about Dave's fiance and needed to piece together a few facts. But the response was even more jarring. Dave wasn't engaged. He wasn't even in a relationship. As far as his family knew, there was no woman in his life at the time. Not a Tanya or anyone else. And just like that, everything shifted. All the lingering doubts, all the oddities that had been brushed aside, the fuzzy details, the inconsistencies, the parts of her story that no one dared question, they all came roaring back. And this time, they couldn't be ignored. Because now, it wasn't just a mistake, it was a lie. And soon, everyone knew it. It was like a domino had been tipped. Once the reporters knew Dave had never been engaged, had never even known her, there was no going back. They retraced every thread of her story, and it all began to snap under scrutiny. Her credentials, her job, her presence in the South Tower, none of it held up. But it wasn't just that her story didn't check out. It was the scale of the deception, the detail, the time, the access. None of the co-workers Tanya claimed to have worked with could ever be identified. No one from the 96th floor remembered her. No one had ever heard her name. The man she said had handed her a wedding ring before dying. No such ring was ever recovered. No widow ever stepped forward. She hadn't just told a few people a sob story. She had become the face of 9/11 survivors. She had led tours at Ground Zero, sat beside mayors and governors, given speeches at memorials, and accepted the grief of strangers like it was her own. She had stood with Wells Crowther's parents, looked them in the eye, and told them how their son had saved her life. And none of it was true. By September 27, 2007, the New York Times ran the exposé. The headline was careful, but the content was clear. The timeline, the interviews, the facts. And the facts were damning. Tanya Head was not who she said she was. She had not been in the towers. She had not worked for Merrill Lynch. She had not been engaged to Dave. She hadn't even been in the country. On September 11th, 2001, Alicia Esteve Head, a Spanish citizen from a wealthy family in Barcelona, had been attending business school classes across the Atlantic. Her real name wasn't even Tanya. When the article dropped, it landed like a bomb. Survivors were stunned. Some cried, others were furious, but all of them asked the same question: why? In the hours that followed, the Survivors Network held an emergency meeting. For many, it felt like betrayal layered on top of trauma. She had been one of them, or so they thought. She had sat beside them, held their hands, heard their nightmares, and somehow she hadn't blinked. She knew what to say, what to feel, how to act. And now, they didn't know what had been real. By the next day, Tanya had been removed as president of the group. Her accounts were shut down, emails unanswered, phone calls ignored. She disappeared, completely. No goodbyes, no explanations. Just gone. But the damage? That stayed. In the months that followed, pieces of her real life began to surface. Her name was Alicia Esteve Head. She was from Barcelona, Spain. She came from a wealthy, influential family, one that people didn't question. Her father and brother had once been jailed for fraud. She had grown up privileged, private, and, by many accounts, deeply insecure. In school, she was known to exaggerate, to fabricate, to reinvent even the most basic events. Her scarred arm, she once told classmates it came from a Ferrari crash. Another time, a horse riding accident. In reality, it had happened years earlier in Spain, long before September 11th. So how did she end up at the center of one of the most respected and tightly bonded communities in American history? Because she understood something very few people do. She knew the power of detail, the way trauma creates gaps in memory, the way people cling to those who survive what they couldn't. She didn't ask for money. She didn't chase book deals. She gave her time, her energy, her focus, all of it, until you forgot to question. She made people feel seen, understood, validated, and in a world where the living often felt invisible, that was everything. And that's what made the betrayal so devastating. Even after she vanished, her shadow stayed behind. Survivors who once found comfort in their group now felt wary, skeptical. They wondered who else wasn't who they claimed to be. Some left the network entirely. Others stopped sharing. The trust was broken. Years later, a few people would spot her, walking the streets of New York or back in Barcelona. Once, she was even confronted by a filmmaker with a camera. Each time, she refused to talk, refused to explain, refused to say why. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe she didn't think she'd ever get caught. Or maybe, in her mind, she really had lived it, just not in the way the rest of us understand. But one thing is certain. Alicia Esteve Head was never in the South Tower on September 11th. She wasn't even in the country on that day. She was in class in Spain. She didn't lose a fiance. She didn't get pulled under a fire truck. She wasn't saved by the man in the red bandana. That part of the story, the one that gave so many people hope, it was all a lie. And yet, for a while, it still helped people heal, which in the end is the strangest part of all.